A motorcycle designed like a scalpel and tuned like a grenade tends to leave a mark, and the Aprilia SXV 550 from the mid-2000s did exactly that. It arrived wrapped in the swagger of a factory race machine and dared everyday riders to keep up with its demands. Imagine a lightweight supermoto barely tamed for street use, a V-twin engine screaming at revs most dual sports never touch, and maintenance intervals that read more like pit lane checklists than owner's manuals. Right from launch, the SXV 550 became a paradox on two wheels, offering elite performance in a package that punished anyone expecting convenience or forgiveness. And that contradiction is what fuels its lasting reputation. Riders looked at the numbers: horsepower per pound, razor throttle response, off-road agility converted for asphalt, and saw something close to forbidden fruit. But behind the thrill was a culture divided between those who worshipped the engineering and those who walked away after a few oil changes and engine rebuilds. The real tension wasn't just whether Aprilia could bottle race performance for public roads, but whether the SXV 550 could survive outside controlled environments without devouring its own legacy. The answer depends on whose hands were on the handlebars, whose wallet backed the upkeep, and whose appetite for chaos outweighed practicality. If you've ever wondered how close a production motorcycle can get to the edge of viability before it tips into legend, the SXV 550 is the case study. Enjoy the ride through its birth, backlash, and unlikely afterlife. And if digging into machines this extreme is your thing, hit like and subscribe and drop a comment on which wild bike deserves the spotlight next. The Aprilia SXV 550 was never built to make sense in a world of practical commuting and long-term ownership. It was created as a provocation, a purebred supermoto that slipped through certification loopholes and landed in the hands of riders who didn't realize they were essentially buying a detuned race bike in street clothes. Its story starts with ambition and risk, because Aprilia wanted to prove it could dominate supermoto the way it had shaken up road racing. And the SXV platform became their weapon of choice, even though most consumers weren't prepared for what that meant in day-to-day life. Micro-story. In the early development phase, the engineers took inspiration directly from competition machines that spent their lives on tracks rather than city streets. And instead of softening the design for wider appeal, they doubled down on the aggressive tuning and lean architecture to keep the bike lighter than anything in its class. On paper that sounded exciting, but soon after launch, service technicians and owners began realizing the oil capacity. Sealing systems and torque delivery all required a racer's discipline. Not a weekend warrior's expectations. Reflection bridge. The Aprilia SXV 550 didn't arrive to meet enthusiasts halfway. It forced them to cross into its world instead. Micro-story. The first wave of SXV owners found themselves captivated by the handling that made tight corners feel like chicanes, and sudden bursts of speed feel like launches off the start grid. Yet many of these riders came from backgrounds where maintenance was measured in thousands of miles rather than hours. So when they discovered the bike's appetite for fresh fluids and careful torque checks, the romance turned into a complicated relationship that split the community into loyalists and skeptics almost immediately. Context digest. The motorcycle market at that time was full of machines catering to broader reliability expectations, and companies knew most buyers wanted performance without punishment. So while another manufacturer would compromise and build a heavier chassis or slightly detune the engine, Aprilia stuck to the formula that made their race effort successful and ignored the signals that street riders might not follow the same rules. It created a buzz but also sowed seeds of concern. Micro-story. Mechanics who encountered the SXV 550 in its early years of sale remember how small missteps like incorrect oil changes or skipped valve checks could lead to serious issues. And dealerships unfamiliar with the platform sometimes misdiagnosed routine quirks as major defects, which only fueled word-of-mouth warnings online. Even so, the riders who mastered the service rhythm talked about the bike as if it were a secret weapon that punished carelessness but rewarded commitment. Reflection bridge. It became clear that owning the Aprilia SXV 550 meant adopting a mindset closer to motorsport than motorcycling. Context digest. From a business perspective, Aprilia had intended the SXV line to elevate its brand image and attract thrill seekers willing to invest in something exclusive. And in some ways that strategy worked because the bike stood out visually and mechanically from everything else in showrooms. But exclusivity can backfire when customers discover their support network isn't ready for the quirks and complexities of a high-strung platform. In the US, parts availability and competent technicians varied widely by region. Micro-story. Enthusiasts who bought the SXV 550 purely for track use often had the best experiences, tracking mileage in sessions rather than months, swapping fluids with precision, and tweaking mapping like it was a competition tool. And these riders were the ones who praised its explosive acceleration and featherweight handling as revolutionary. On the other side were owners trying to use it as a commuter or casual weekend bike and running headfirst into the consequences of misaligned expectations. Context digest. The regulatory climate when the SXV was introduced allowed certain performance-focused models to slip through with limited concessions to emissions and reliability standards, and Aprilia leveraged that opening to bring in a motorcycle that was barely domesticated. But those same regulations evolved quickly, leaving little room for future updates or rehomologation of the concept, and that contributed to its short lifespan in showrooms because adapting it would mean re-engineering its core identity. The brand wasn't willing to dilute it, micro-story, in garages across the US. Owners swapped stories about rebuilding engines within the first few thousand miles or discovering coolant seepage that required resealing. The cases because the unique split design of the V-twin demanded perfect assembly tolerances. And while some saw this as an unacceptable flaw, others took it as a challenge and dove into online forums for solutions and upgrades that extended the life of the bike far beyond what casual buyers could manage. The divide between believers and disillusioned riders became a phenomenon of its own. Reflection bridge. Few motorcycles polarized their owners the way the Aprilia SXV 550 did, because it refused to hide its true nature under marketing promises. As time went on, the realities of ownership shaped the culture that formed around it and created a narrative where survival, adaptation, and passion became the defining traits of SXV riders. That evolution of identity sets the stage for examining why the bike's reputation outpaced its sales and how those who stuck with it shaped its enduring legacy, leading directly into the next phase of its story. The Aprilia SXV 550 had already shaken its early adopters into two camps, those who relished the volatility and those who regretted the gamble. But as time passed, its reputation hardened into something bigger than individual experiences. What emerged was a conversation about the limits of street legal performance and whether manufacturers should even attempt to civilize competition machines, because the SXV 550 proved that bridging those worlds often leaves both sides dissatisfied. Enthusiasts who stuck with it became evangelists for a style of riding that put precision maintenance and high-intensity bursts of power at the center of the lifestyle, turning ownership into a personal badge of honor rather than a practical investment. Micro-story. Some of the most passionate riders began organizing small meetups specifically for SXV owners, where advice, parts, and cautionary tales flowed freely, and newcomers learned that the bike rewarded mechanical literacy as much as riding skill. At these events, owners compared notes on custom mapping, improved sealing techniques, and aftermarket parts that made the machine more durable. And these shared solutions began to rewrite the narrative from disaster-prone to misunderstood thoroughbred, but only among those willing to do the work. Context digest. The broader industry watched this unfold with a mix of curiosity and caution, because while the success of purpose-built performance machines on the track was undeniable, translating that success to the open road required compromises that contradicted the purity of the design. Other companies saw the blowback from the SXV 550 and began leaning into safer tuning strategies, larger service intervals, and more forgiving components, essentially using Aprilia's experiment as a case study in how far was too far when courting niche buyers. Reflection bridge. The Aprilia SXV 550 became a lesson for both riders and manufacturers in what happens when ambition outpaces infrastructure. Micro story. Riders who modified their SXV 550s with upgraded gaskets, redesigned fuel systems, and remapped ECUs often discovered a version of the bike that could survive long-term abuse while retaining its explosiveness. But that tuning process demanded time, money, and expertise that most casual owners didn't possess. Those who succeeded often spoke about the transformation like taming a wild animal, and they credited the aftermarket community more than the original manufacturer for making the bike sustainable beyond its initial run. Context digest. In the US, the parts pipeline and dealer support fluctuated dramatically depending on the region, leaving some owners isolated unless they turned to online forums, small independent mechanics, or imported components. This ecosystem of improvisation stood in stark contrast to the conventional ownership model where buyers expect service plans, warranties, and standardized maintenance routines. and it demonstrated how the SXV 550 inadvertently fostered a parallel culture of resourcefulness among its most dedicated fans. Microstory. The tension between intended use and real-world application became even more obvious when riders tried to register, insure, or resell the bike because many agencies and shops viewed it as an anomaly that didn't fit neatly into typical categories. And that pushback left owners either fiercely protective of their machines or quick to move them along to the next thrill seeker. In some cases, the resale value held surprisingly well among enthusiasts who saw the limited production and uncompromising design as collector traits, not liabilities. Reflection bridge. Every trade-off the Aprilia SXV 550 demanded pushed it further into legend territory rather than mainstream relevance. As attention shifted from initial disappointment to cult appreciation, the conversation around the bike stopped being about whether it had failed and started being about what it represented. A rare moment when a manufacturer chased performance without fear of backlash, leaving behind a machine that still provokes debate about responsibility, vision, and the cost of standing out. That shift in perception opens the door to the final outcome of its story, where legacy, adaptation, and hindsight converge to explain why the SXV 550 continues to matter long after production ended. The Aprilia SXV 550 entered its later years not as a cautionary tale to be discarded, but as a benchmark for extremity that few dared to replicate. By the time its production run ended, the bike had already etched itself into the memory of riders who believed a motorcycle could be both a privilege and a burden, and that contradiction only enhanced its mystique. The SXV 550 didn't soften with age. It simply became a litmus test for how far someone was willing to go in pursuit of performance, and in that role, it outlived many of its contemporaries even without updates or factory support. Microstory. In garages where the bike still rests on stands or sits ready for weekend abuse, owners often speak of it as something irreplaceable because every ride feels consequential. Every startup a reminder that high-compression engineering doesn't forgive laziness. Some have converted their SXV 550s into track-only machines, treating them like vintage racers rather than obsolete road bikes. And the satisfaction they get from keeping them alive has more to do with personal pride than resale value or practicality. The machine has shifted from product to project, from commodity to companion, context digest. In the wider motorcycle landscape, the SXV 550's influence is felt indirectly rather than through direct successors because most companies learn to temper their ambitions or at least widen their support networks before unleashing niche weapons into the market. Instead of inspiring replicas, it inspired caution, and many modern supermotos now blend aggressive performance with everyday durability as a direct counterpoint to the SXV's uncompromising stance. Engineers and executives quietly point to examples like this when discussing risk versus reward in high-performance development. Reflection bridge. The Aprilia SXV 550 didn't vanish. It forced adaptation around it. Microstory. Enthusiasts who collect rare machines have increasingly begun viewing the SXV 550 through the same lens as limited-run track homologations, understanding that its quirks and failures are inseparable from its identity. That means some owners now preserve them with meticulous care, sourcing discontinued parts and machining custom solutions to keep the engine sealed and the electronics healthy. And those efforts have transformed the bike into a living relic of a time when regulations and restraint hadn't yet closed the gap between racing fantasy and street reality. Context digest. Even in online spaces where performance bikes are discussed daily, the SXV 550 is referenced with a mix of reverence and warning, often compared not to other production motorcycles but to tools designed for competition. Threads and videos weighing the cost of ownership against the thrill of operation consistently circle back to the idea that understanding the bike is more important than simply riding it, and that mindset has shaped a unique corner of the community that views the machine as both a test and a treasure. Microstory. A handful of tuners and builders have even taken the SXV 550 platform and reimagined it with modern sealing solutions, reinforced internals, and tailored mapping to create versions of the bike that can withstand broader use without sacrificing the core brutality. These one-off builds highlight the latent potential locked inside the original design and suggest that with more time and resources, the manufacturer might have turned the SXV concept into a long-term force rather than a short-lived phenomenon. Reflection bridge. Yet the very fact that it remained unchanged is part of why its legacy resonates so strongly. In the end, the Aprilia SXV 550 taught riders, engineers, and the industry that pushing boundaries comes with costs measured not only in performance metrics, but in trust, support, and longevity. The bike endures not because it was widely adopted, but because it refused to blend in, and that resistance to compromise cemented its place in motorcycling culture. What remains now is a machine that continues to incite debate, admiration, and fascination. And that conversation leads naturally into the final reckoning of what its story means for those who still chase machines that defy expectations. The Aprilia SXV 550 didn't just enter the market and disappear. It arrived, disrupted, alienated, inspired, and then lingered in memory long after its short production window closed. And that trajectory carries important meaning for riders in the US, who weigh passion against practicality. The so what of this motorcycle reveals itself through three lenses that continue to matter: ownership realities, market influence, and the legacy it carved by refusing compromise. On the ownership side, anyone considering the SXV 550 today is either buying into a project or curating a collectible, not trying to solve transportation needs. It's the kind of bike that demands mechanical literacy or a trusted specialist, and that requirement alone trims the audience to a sliver of enthusiasts with patience and resources. Parts still circulate through online groups, breakers, and small suppliers, but nobody pretends it's convenient. The commitment is closer to vintage racing culture than modern street riding, and that comparison explains why the SXV 550 still holds appeal even without dealer backing or mainstream support. You don't casually own one, you commit to it. From a market perspective, the SXV 550 forces an uncomfortable reflection on what performance means outside a racetrack. Other manufacturers observed exactly how narrow the success window was for a machine this extreme. They updated their approach, blending aggression with insulation and providing maintenance schedules people could live with. You can trace the careful calibration of many modern supermoto and hypermotored models back to this moment in time when a company went all in and discovered the limits of tolerance. The Aprilia SXV 550 became the ghost in the planning room, a reminder that ambition without infrastructure is a gamble few brands are willing to repeat. Its influence can be felt not because others copied it, but because others avoided its pitfalls while borrowing its intensity in measured doses. Legacy is where the SXV 550 takes on its mythic shape. It stands as an outlier that proved a motorcycle could be too raw for broad adoption and still earn devotion. Riders who mastered its temperament talk about it the way someone might talk about an apex predator: fierce, unpredictable, and unforgettable. The fact that it still circulates in videos, forums, and garage builds shows it left a template for what happens when design philosophy prioritizes excitement over accommodation. That philosophy didn't vanish. It just retreated to the fringes, where it continues to inspire custom builds, track conversions, and debates about how far manufacturers should push. The final word on the Aprilia SXV 550 is that it carved out space for bikes defined not by how many were sold, but by how deeply they affected those who encountered them. In a world where most machines compete for broad appeal, this one chose to be a legend in the margins, and sometimes the machines that scare off the masses are the same ones that stay unforgettable.